political education because it makes us better activists and more thoughtful and more informed and more well-equipped fighters, we hope. And along those lines, we have somebody here who will help us fight the Constitution. A document that I've never been much of a fan of. It's a deeply undemocratic document that's been an essential foundation for plutocratic rule. Madison and the other founders were quite explicit about devising a governing structure that would incorporate elements of democracy, but all within a system that constrained popular power in the name of preventing mob rule. Thus, the abominations of the Electoral College and the Senate, anti-democratic by design. Electoral College very much on our mind these days. Our Constitution is probably the most difficult in the world to amend. It's very short and often vague, which gives courts a lot of room in interpreting it. Oh, and it's a foundation of American imperialism. Yet this document is venerated to a degree with few parallels anywhere else in the world. The Mormon Church officially believes it to be divinely inspired, a belief shared by 37% of white evangelicals and 18% of the overall U.S. population, according to a Pew poll from a couple of years ago. I just happened to have a document here. I feel like Joe McCarthy. I got this the other day in my email from the Heritage Foundation. They know their audience. Dear Doug, as a fellow conservative, you're likely already well know and feel the pressure that's being put upon you to abandon your principles by the progressives and the far left. You know that fighting back is what you believe in. Fighting back for what you believe in is the best thing to do. In these trying times, we conservatives must turn to the greatest document in the history of the world, our Constitution. So that's just one instance of the Constitution worship that afflicts this political culture. So given my long-standing but generally unpopular contempt for the document, I was very happy to learn of Aziz Rana's book, The Constitutional Bind, How Americans Came to Idolize a Document That Fails Them, published by the University of Chicago Press. Aziz is a professor of law at Boston College Law School, where, as he puts it, his research and teaching center on American constitutional law and political development. In particular, his work focuses on how shifting notions of race, citizenship, and empire have shaped legal and political identity since the founding. His previous book, Two Faces of American Freedom, as he puts it, situates the American experience within the global history of colonialism, examining the intertwined relationship in American constitutional practice between internal accounts of freedom and external projects of power and expansion. That helps explain why Aziz analyzes the Constitution not just as a framework for domestic governance, but also as a document of empire. His erudition and force of argument are very impressive. Aziz Rana.
Thanks so much, Doug, for that lovely introduction. Thanks to all the organizers for putting this together, and all of you for coming out on a Friday night in a beautiful New York City evening. So I appreciate your presence. So I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes. And what I want to do is work through the arguments of the book, yes, but against the backdrop of this moment in the United States. We're living during striking times when it truly feels like many of the bedrock elements of the American project, frankly, from Gaza and Lebanon to right here in the context of an ongoing election, are coming apart at the seams. And the story of the Constitution and the Constitution's role in this unraveling, I think, is something that's increasingly apparent in a way that honestly doesn't really require me as somebody that teaches constitutional law to lay out. You just have to be in the country at the moment and frankly read the newspaper so that we have a constitutional system that very clearly is organized not on the principle of one person, one vote, but through geographical units, the antiquated structure of the state. And as a consequence, it has all of these rippling effects for the capacity of ordinary citizens to have their views, again, from concerns about whether or not we should pursue a ceasefire to whether or not there should be universal health care, actually enacted as the policies of the country. So Doug already went through some of these. I'll rehearse them just very briefly because, again, I don't know if it's that useful to repeat. But because of the focus on states as the basic unit of representation, that then structures how the House of Representatives is organized. It produces gerrymandering in the House. It leads to the structure of the Senate, which again creates paralysis in the kinds of laws that can be implemented. And then through the Senate, because of the Electoral College, again, state-based, it means that we have presidents now increasingly routinely that can win the presidency while losing the popular vote, and then combine with the Senate to fundamentally structure the nature of the federal courts. And so that the folks that serve on the Supreme Court are wildly out of step with popular opinion. Trump alone was able to nominate and get confirmed to the Supreme Court 3 justices. All Democratic presidents since 1968 have been able to nominate and get confirmed a total of 5. And all of that occurs against a backdrop in which the Constitution, again, is perhaps the hardest to amend. And so you have a funneling effect of constitutional debate and change going into a court system that is organized to dramatically overrepresent both the demographic and cultural minority in the country, wildly out of step with where most Americans are. And yet, if you grew up like I did in the United States at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of this one, you would have grown up in a culture that was not that different, frankly, than what was just presented from the Heritage Foundation, which is the Constitution wasn't just an institutional infrastructure that we muddled through, but was as close as one could get in political reality to an ideal version of quote unquote liberal democracy. And so how do we make sense of that divergence? And I think that divergence is both generating policy outcomes that are deeply troubling in the present, but also an example of a general divergence that we're all living through, which is the forms of inequality, injustice, and violence that American statecraft ends up generating, and the presumptions of American exceptionalism that undergird these practices. The book is an effort to make sense of this dichotomy, with the Constitution at the center, but really against the backdrop of a broader story of American national identity that became intertwined with the Constitution. And the argument that I make in the book is that you cannot understand the rise of modern constitutional veneration, and I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by modern constitutional veneration, without understanding that it takes place at the same time as another decisive political development that's almost never discussed alongside the Constitution. And that's the fact that the U.S. moves from a regional settler polity in the Americas at the end of the 19th century to a globally hegemonic project by the time we get to the second half of the 20th century. And that the Constitution and constitutional support, in particular, a story of national identity and meaning that gets wrapped up with the text, becomes central to the justification and spread of American power. And I want to work through this by going through, let's say, a few different steps that are part of the book's argument, and then reflecting on our own present for us as politically engaged folks. So first, I want to just tease out what I mean by modern constitutional veneration. What's the story of the Constitution that's being supported today and also over the course of the 20th century? Then I want to just trace out the history of how this version of constitutional meaning really takes off and becomes consolidated and entrenched. And then after that, I want to work through left critiques. And in particular, I'm going to spend time with the socialist tradition, especially early 20th century American socialism in the form of organizations like the Socialist Party of America, anarcho-syndicalist groups like the IWW, and then Black socialist efforts across the 20th century as a way of thinking about alternative constitutional actors, alternative forms of constitutional memory that can help us make sense of our own present. And then I'm going to end with a couple kind of political takeaways that hopefully can be the basis for a conversation that we'll have. All right. What do I mean by modern constitutional veneration? In the book, the basic term that I really focus on is something I call Credal constitutionalism. And by Credal constitutionalism, I'm invoking a phrase, the American Creed, that's probably most closely associated with a Swedish sociologist named Gunnar Myrdal, who led a team of various social scientists, including some, great African-American social scientists, that produced a book in 1944 called The American Dilemma. And in the book is an exploration of American race relations. He refers to the idea of an American creed as defining national identity. And by this, he means the thought that from the founding, the country had been committed to principles of freedom and equality, and that the American story is the steady fulfillment of these principles. They're emblazoned in the Declaration of Independence. This idea of a creed has its initial genesis really in anti-slavery and abolitionist politics. So you see it expressed by folks like Abraham Lincoln, but really more specifically by somebody like Frederick Douglass. If we think about this idea of the country as free and equal from the founding, it's very closely associated now with a conventional, familiar way of thinking about constitutional meaning. So that there's this idea that the Constitution is closely tied to the notion that it fulfills the principles of the Declaration of Independence. It's the concrete institutional infrastructure in which those principles end up getting expressed. And at the same time, that linkage of the Constitution and the Creed has increasingly gone hand in hand with a set of other commitments. Now, all of these, if you laid them out, will be kind of part of just the drinking water of what many of us would have been raised with. So the next element would be that the Constitution and the Creed also are tied to a vision of civil liberties that's anti-totalitarian, that's juxtaposed against Nazi Germany, against the Soviet Union, and that establishes the way in which individual autonomy is protected from certain types of communitarian state infringements when it comes to the free exercise of religion or free speech. And that, critically, is also then tied to an account of property, that civil liberties and economic liberty are joined because property rights are also an autonomous site for individual protection from state entrenchment. So you have the argument that there's a defense of the creed, there's a defense of civil liberties, but civil liberties are connected to an account of a market economy. So market capitalism, even if there's some degree of economic regulation, nonetheless, there's a presumption about the essentially bedrock nature of American capitalism. And then all of that is tied to a vision of constrained representative government. Yes, you have an electoral system that's meant to represent the governed, but this electoral system is marked by checks and balances, by a structure of federalism that distinguishes various forms of political power so that all of these forms of power can check a perceived fear of tyrannical majorities. And at the top of this system of constrained representation is an insulated Supreme Court whose function is to protect rights, and indeed over time, whose very identity becomes coterminous with the Constitution entirely. And then all of that is a basis for making an argument that the US is genuinely exceptional. And because it's genuinely exceptional, it has a right to exercise power on the global stage. In other words, because of the nature of its own institutions, because of the exceptional terms of its political culture, then it can enjoy a kind of international police power to step inside and outside of legal arrangements to ensure that some system of freedom and democracy gets spread to all. All of this is the story of the Constitution in the country that if you listen to Harris at the Democratic National Convention, if you listen to any speech by Obama, but if you listen to speeches by McCain, by Bush Jr., that they're continually invoking. But note, none of these ideological elements, the idea that the Declaration necessarily is connected to the Constitution, or that both are tied to a theory of civil liberties, or that civil liberties has to be connected to a theory of property. In fact, some of the great socialist civil libertarians made just the exact opposite argument, which is to protect civil liberties and dissent, you had to engage in meaningful democratic control of the economy because these two things were fundamentally disjointed. Or that if you support the connection of civil liberties, market capitalism, that should go hand in hand with a theory of profoundly anti-populist constraints on democracy, or that any of that is then a justification for American global hegemony. But they've all of these disparate elements have been joined together in a single cohesive story of the national project. And it's that cohesive story that ends up consolidating by the mid-20th century. And it's that story as well that we're seeing break down. And so when the book is providing an account of how that emerged, it's really less about the particular details of the constitutional text in some way, but how is it that American and an idea of an American way of life ended up becoming wrapped up with that document? Okay, so what's the way of thinking about this? I think the first thing to say, which is, in a sense, fairly self-evident, is that constitutional support has had its ebbs and flows. There's been periods of support for the Constitution, criticism of the Constitution, and the meaning people have attached to the text has changed dramatically over time. If we were having this conversation in the early 19th century, in the mid-19th century, probably the dominant way of venerating the Constitution would be it's a document of compromise. This is Daniel Webster's, the senator out of Massachusetts. His notion of the Constitution is a compromise between the regions, especially over the issue of slavery, so that the country could engage in economic and territorial expansion. Take a moment, step back, think about what that argument means. The dominant way in the North of defending the Constitution in the 1840s and 1850s would have been to say, you know what, the Constitution's great because it allows us to avoid slavery, the profound sin of the American project, so as to ensure that we can engage in native expropriation through territorial conquest. That is the very opposite of the Obama story of constitutional meaning. And so that then requires us to think about how this shift took place. If the idea of a creed as something that takes off initially with an anti-slavery moment, it's also significant to note that that's primarily housed within the Black counterpublic, both before the Civil War and then especially during Reconstruction. But the Black experience in the second half of the 19th century is a shift from bondage to freedom to new forms of bondage under Jim Crow white supremacy. And that produces really profound internal debates within Black society about whether or not to hold on to a vision of a creedal constitution, and indeed whether it's possible at all to have a shared national project with individuals and constituencies that were fundamentally opposed to the basic humanity of Black people. And so in the late 19th century, the idea of a creedal constitution is a minor strand within white society. It's instead arguments about white supremacy are far more prevalent. Teddy Roosevelt in the first decade of the 20th century sends part of the Pacific Fleet to Australia and New Zealand after Japan defeats Russia in war to say that just like the US, Australia and New Zealand are also quote unquote white man's country. And that's a far more dominant way of thinking about national identity. So the creedal link to the Constitution is at a low ebb. At the same time, that would have been an era in which the rise of labor movement politics meant that a competing narrative of the Constitution, and one that had far greater, actually bedrock support within working class communities across the racial divide, was that actually the Constitution was a counter-revolutionary document. It was a document that pushed back against whatever democratic energy might have existed in the Declaration of Independence. And this was precisely because of the plethora of veto points that we've already discussed that shot through the entire system. Veto points that essentially compromised the one tool that poor people might have had, which is the power of the vote within a political order, and made it very easy for racial and business elites to engage in a form of invisible government that imposed their will and interests across all of the levers of a corporate state, and especially within the court system, irrespective of whether or not there was popular support. So how does this start to shift? I argue that this begins to change both as a domestic story, but also when it comes to the global stage, with the US's decision, the decision of American elites to turn to the international as a way of coming to grips with the forms of social crisis and dislocation that mark the late 19th, early 20th century. If the country had been a settler project, Settlement had been the basis for internal white cohesion. The closing of the frontier, the intensification of industrial conflict makes it very difficult to see settlement as continuing to serve these roles. And instead, what many folks, especially within the Republican Party, people like Teddy Roosevelt see, is the idea of going abroad to find new markets as a way of recovering perceived economic insecurity at home and also restitching a national fabric. But what happens almost immediately is that American officials come to recognize that the U.S. is a relatively late player to the colonial game, and that the first half of the 20th century is a period in which you have the steady breakdown of the old imperial order through 2 world wars and intensifying non-white political assertiveness and anti-colonialism. This is experienced almost immediately in the Philippines, which the U.S. occupies and takes over, where just as a condition of being able to assert some degree of control over Filipino politics, that American officials are turning power back to indigenous local elites and families, and then have to answer the question of, well, what is the U.S. doing in a place like the Philippines if you're having to engage in mediated forms of self-rule for local communities just to be able to stay on the ground because you're facing intense forms of guerrilla conflict and independence war? In response, what you have is initially a set of Republican officials who have links back to the anti-slavery arguments of the party, saying, well, wait a second. What defines the U.S. as different from the European empires is that it's motivated by this principle of constitutionalism. But this principle of constitutionalism is something that is culturally specific to a Euro-American project that's entrenched not just in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but in everything from the Mayflower Compact all the way to the federal Constitution. And what the U.S. does in a place like the Philippines, what it does in a place like Puerto Rico, is it spreads a theory of self-government. But it's a theory of self-government that in the here and now requires American tutelage because of its own kind of cultural maturity by comparison with these other communities. And so it's surrounded by quote unquote less mature political orders that are unstable and that require the continuous intervention of the American state in order to be able to construct the right kind of statecraft, the right types of economy, and that once the U.S. has generated this project, it can set free a set of new governments. This argument is swimming upstream at a time of intense political mobilization against the forms of class inequality that exist in the U.S., but starts to find a real popular base during World War I, where the country has its first Constitution Day events. If you've wondered about Constitution Day at universities, its genesis is during World War I with groups like the National Security League that were pro-war military preparedness groups and that turned to this argument about the Constitution as a justification for the war effort. And indeed, the war effort then becomes a basis for rallying initially kind of nativist, more conservative bloc of citizens within the country around the text in service of a jingoistic project of American global and political power. All of this is still pretty deeply contested, and it's deeply contested through the 1920s, through the 1930s, and the 30s see a real upsurge of arguments, especially against the backdrop of the Depression, saying that the basic infrastructure of American institutions will have to be fundamentally reformed in order to be able to address governing social problems. This is probably the last time that the possibility of another convention or really significant alterations to the text of the Constitution are seriously in the offing in the United States. But what happens is that the New Deal is able to make a kind of uneasy accommodation with the constitutional system because just the sheer number of working class labor support for FDR overwhelms these veto points. In 1936, New Deal politicians make up 80% of the House and Senate. And then through that, they're able to overwhelm the court so as to ensure that a somewhat limited social welfare state ends up getting enacted. But even still, that kind of accommodation is not the same as widespread worship and embrace, especially of the institutional infrastructure of government. The next big step is World War II. And from 39 to 41, the country sees rolling celebrations, but interestingly, not celebrations of things like the Supreme Court or checks and balances, but of the first 10 amendments, which are now being venerated as a Bill of Rights. The 50th and 100th anniversaries of the Bill of Rights, 1841, 1891, there wasn't a ton of commemoration. 3 states had not yet ratified the Bill of Rights even in 1938. But between 39 and 41, against the backdrop of the U.S.'s likely entrance into World War II to confront Nazi Germany, the Bill of Rights gets reclaimed as a dramatic world historical human rights charter. This is the language that FDR gives to it in his speech on the 150th anniversary of its ratification, that distinguishes the U.S. from Nazi Germany and now links the idea of the creed and the Constitution to a language about civil liberties in a really kind of decisive way. And then following the war, the Cold War really cements that identification, but also adds other key elements to it, where American officials are trying to make sense of why they view the U.S. as different from the Soviet Union, and also why the U.S. had avoided the perceived kind of totalitarian turns of European fascism and communism, both according to these arguments, and avoided, for instance, going down a dark McCarthyite path. The argument that Cold War actors make is that it's not just the civil libertarian commitments or the notion of the creed, but it's now that infrastructure, that decision-making infrastructure that limits the power of mass majorities to overwhelm the institutions of government, that also carefully connects civil liberties to economic liberty so that you understand market capitalism as part of the way in which you entrench individual autonomy against overwhelming forms of state power. And you see the rise at this moment in time of veneration of the Supreme Court as the kind of archetypical anti-populist institutional form that constrain the perceived excesses of popular power. It's a moment in which now the Constitution is increasingly associated with the Supreme Court, and all of this pays off for Cold War liberalism with a set of racial reforms that peak during the Warren Court years, during cases like Brown versus Board of Education. The particular dynamics of the Cold War bring together center-left and center-right elites to pursue various types of ameliorative reforms, and this becomes a justification for the constitutional system, and you have traditional civil rights activists that are using the language of the Credal Constitution as a way of reconstructing the meaning of domestic politics, very much alongside a defense of the U.S.'s national security project. Nonetheless, even as these ideas are fully consolidated, the country does have one last significant period of left constitutional critique in the late 60s and the early 1970s. In the wake of civil rights achievements, but against the backdrop of formal racial equality, but deep and entrenched economic racial inequalities, alongside the U.S.'s actions in Vietnam that raise again the specter of the country, not as this promoter of freedom and equality abroad, as fundamentally anti-imperial, but engaging in new forms of imperial practice that are themselves a continuation of the old imperial system and order. The most kind of notable form of such activism takes place in 1970 on Constitution Day, or in early September as a counter-Constitution Day event. And this is the Black Panthers' effort to bring together a number of factions of the New Left to generate a new constitution through what they call the People's Revolutionary Constitutional Convention, something that we can discuss. The Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, something that we can discuss in a bit. For various reasons, this left moment gets contained, the most significant of which are fundamental changes in the nature of white working class politics, sociological and political shifts that mean that just at the time when you have this rising political discontent, you don't have anything like the base for constitutional opposition that had existed in earlier periods in American history. And instead, the fallout of Vietnam is really a kind of growing restorationist bent in American life. Not just a consolidation of creedal constitutional ideas, but a growing culture of hagiography around the framers and early American elites. This hagiography is given sort of striking form in the 200th anniversary of the Declaration in 1976, the 200th anniversary of the Constitution in 1987, the range of books, works of art, musicals about founders that come to define really the period between the 70s and the 2010s. And in this setting, it provides the groundwork for what becomes the dominant social movement around the law. And that's the rise of social conservatism and of originalism. Because to the extent that the center and the center left has now fully reclaimed the framers, not as enslavers, not as economic elites, but as proto-abolitionists, as proto-class egalitarians, as always from the founding have been committed to principles of freedom and equality, it becomes very easy culturally for the right to say, well, in that case, why don't we just follow the will of the framers, what they might have wanted in 1788 or in 1868? And of course, an intellectually honest originalist will not necessarily, in every interpretive debate, reach a position that is the equivalent of what the new right might want. But a culture that venerates a distant past is a culture far afield from the kind of experimental and democratic polity able to think seriously about how to address structural and persistent features of injustice that mark the present. Now, across this, and here I'd like to turn to what we can learn in a way from left critique over the course of the 20th century before some political payoffs. Across that 20th century, there were forms of political mobilizing around the Constitution that presented alternatives to this increasingly official story, desiccated and limited in its ability to address foundational grievances, organized through a politics of innocence, unable to see the links between American power in the present and long-standing forms of empire. These folks, I would argue, for our own purposes today, are not just significant constitutional actors, but have more to offer us than the range of legal experts and heroes that have been presented as the primary sources of constitutional meaning and argument. And so it is incumbent on us as figures of the left, or as folks that are committed to leftist ideas, to think seriously about constitutional memory as something that is expansive enough to take on board the ideas of those that struggled on behalf of constitutional change. I'll just mention two strands of socialist argument. Early 20th century socialists made a number of policy proposals that would fit right in with, frankly, arguments that we see all around us. I'll go through them very quickly because they're kind of self-evident. They too said we should have a system of electoral democracy premised on one person, one vote, organized through proportional representation, which has things like multi-member districts that fundamentally removes money from the terrain of a political argument and contestation, that contests the structure of the Senate, either abolishes it or reforms it significantly, that alters the state as a unit of representation, and so that the state, it doesn't have a stranglehold on how representation works, that reforms systematically the courts, including by imposing various kinds of ethics requirements on how courts operate, and at the same time removes large chunks of constitutional debate from the funnel into the courts alone, so that you have a simplified amendment process that ensures that there are many pathways to engage in constitutional change. This is all the stuff of, frankly, a functioning partial democracy, not even something that I would view as a genuinely democratic project. It would make the US look much more like the modes of social democracy that ended up emerging across Europe, but also Asia and Africa over the course of the 20th century. More interesting to me than this analysis, they also said, and this was part of the internal debate among left forces, that it is vital not to think of constitutional debate as just sort of liberal parliamentarism, proceduralism that is disconnected from the material struggles that working people are engaged in. And the reason why they said this was that you could not ultimately separate the process and the substance. By this I mean, whether you're in the workplace or you're in an electoral voting booth, there are rules of the game that are at play. And these rules of the game are structured to ensure that those with power and privilege are able to reproduce their own interests and impose their own will. The rules of the game are stacked against those communities that are most oppressed. And if that's the case, you have to see these rules operating everywhere, and you have to work to contest them. If you want, this would have been the story in the early part of the 20th century, if you want to ban child labor or have an 8-hour day or ensure various kinds of socioeconomic rights, you're going to have to change how the political system operates, because the rules that structure the political system make certain kinds of outcomes far more likely, create very particular types of incentive structures that end up generating precisely the problems that you see and make very difficult the capacity to intervene in those material disputes. And in a sense, this vision of constitutional politics, of understanding the Constitution as another terrain for political struggle, is something that I think is valid for us to reflect on. They didn't fetishize the Constitution as a type of silver bullet that could solve all problems. They didn't imagine that if you had a convention or a simplified amendment, all things would flow from it. They didn't even necessarily presume that in the context of limited resources, one should just focus on legal or procedural reforms rather than, let's say, engage in direct action at the workplace. But they argued that you had to have a comprehensive theory of political action that was able to understand the linkages between what you might think of as purely procedural and what you understand as material. And then the second kind of socialist politics around the Constitution that I think is worth highlighting is the long tradition of Black socialism. Black socialists argued that yes, labor activists were right to see the Constitution as a counter-revolutionary document, but they failed to engage seriously with the underlying nature of the society. And indeed, even the framing of the Constitution as counter-revolutionary fetishized a specific vision of the Declaration of Independence as establishing basic principles of freedom and equality for all. And for somebody like Harry Haywood, Hubert Harrison, W.E.B. Du Bois, later on James and Grace Lee Boggs, the argument that they made, they didn't use the term settler colonialism, that's for another later period, but the argument that they made had very clear resonances. It was that to understand how authoritarianism operates in the US, before the founding, before the Declaration of Independence, even in some of the language of the Declaration of Independence itself that's less commonly referenced, and certainly following the Constitution, it was critical to note the extent to which the society was organized around providing economic independence and political control for insiders on grounds of coercing labor for outsiders, initially and especially enslaved Black labor, and expropriating land from Native peoples. And that these features that were joined together constructed a society that shaped who enjoyed economic and political sovereignty, most egregiously, sort of like explosively, in the politics of Jim Crow segregation and slavery in the South, but really across the country. And that analysis, therefore, required two things. It required a politics of democracy, but a politics of democracy that had to be joined to a decolonial agenda. And when Panthers and other organizations got together in Philadelphia for the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, they were putting front and center the idea of a decolonial objective for the national project. What did this mean? The democracy element of it was you have to start with that unit of the state. And here, somebody like Harry Haywood was talking about the black belt thesis. He said you had a black majority in the 20s and 30s from Eastern Virginia to Eastern Texas. But this black majority was divided by the state unit that ended up reproducing the political power of a planter class that could then control the land. And that the only way black people, and by extension all Americans, would be free is if there was a fundamental redistribution of the economic order. But that could not take place unless there were basic changes to the nature of the political system, to the basic administrative units. You had to break up those states into different types of administrative units that were organized around majorities of poor whites and blacks that could collectively and solidaristically pursue far-reaching economic changes. And so they understood the project of unleashing American democracy, tied to many of the kinds of objectives that groups like the Socialist Party of America might have had, as closely wedded to the particulars of the form of white supremacy and white authoritarianism that existed in the US that was grounded in a specific colonial history that tied colonialism to various forms of capitalism. And then for the Panthers, as well as folks in modes of indigenous political activism, other groups, all of this had to recognize the centrality of the US within an emergent global system that was both distinct from but a continuation of past forms of imperial power, and that required alongside these democratic reforms a thickening of what it meant to actually enjoy meaningful sovereign power in the country. And that entailed land return and concurrent sovereignty for Native peoples. It meant a significant project of reparations, but reparations understood concretely as global redistribution for colonized peoples as well as those subject to American global power. And then at home, a whole host of policies that in the 60s would have been referred to as the freedom budget. So things like the universal and extensive provision of basic rights like health, housing, education, alongside a guaranteed income, a guaranteed job, and then transformations to the security infrastructure of the state. A fundamental demobilization and dismantling of both the policing and carceral infrastructure as well as the security apparatus that defined the country, and all of that alongside a genuine accounting for the colonial history that marked the US. Notice, this was a vision of both democracy and decolonization that was not zero-sum, was not predicated on separation or removal, but was instead based on the idea that in a country like the US, that is a majority white country, that the way for the country to actually generate something like equal and effective freedom for all would be to conceive of a project that genuinely thought of everyone as worthy of sovereign control. But that was not possible so long as the country persisted in replicating narratives of national identity that fundamentally repudiated the underlying structural realities of hierarchy that shaped both domestic and global politics. Where does that leave us now? Here I'll be very quick so that we can get to questions. The first thing to note is that we're living alongside this kind of breakdown in the American project with an interesting divergence in how American centrism is confronting this breakdown. So again, if you think about the DNC speeches, but just sort of the politics of establishment Democrats, there is pushback against a whole range of positions that one might associate with the DSA or the left wing of the party, from like It could be about healthcare, universal healthcare. It could be about economic policy. It could be foreign policy in the context of what's going on in Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon. But the one place where there's a fair amount of centrist pickup is the critique of the Constitution. So you read the New York Times, a lot of discussion about how messed up the Constitution is. You talk to Democratic Party politicians, they're willing to defend the idea that the court needs to be systematically reformed. Maybe the court should be expanded to 15. It needs ethics reform. And even think about Biden. What was Biden's last play to hold on to running again for the White House? It was to say, you know what? After years of championing the court being like the most intense form of not just constitution worship or court worshiper, he was backing court expansion and court reform. And I think that requires us thinking about why, which is there's a way in which in this moment in time, for a political centrist that's deeply committed to the story, that mid-20th century story of the Constitution, of the Credal Constitution that I described, Cold War liberalism, that the court in particular, this Trump court effectively, is viewed as a fundamental affront to the history and legacy of liberal jurists on the court, of the Warren Court, of a specific vision of mid-20th century American life. And for this reason, attacking the court or calling for these kinds of changes is part of its own brand, interestingly, of nostalgia, where it's like all of this other stuff potentially kind of disrupts the story of the country as having basically solved its collective problems. But the court and court reform, constitutional reform, can both reconsolidate the power of the Democratic Party, but it can also move the country back to when, we had the right people on the court. We can treat as stars and valorize not just justices that are writing dissents, but justices that are writing majorities. How should the left respond to this? So my view is the response should not be a knee-jerk view that, well, if centrists are calling for court reform, we should just be suspicious and reject court reform. Because the simple truth, as socialists have argued for like 100+ years, is that, again, these rules end up shaping what's politically possible. And just because you might have centrist support for a policy, that doesn't mean that those policies couldn't have their own transformative effects that make it more likely to pursue even more far-reaching changes. But it nonetheless means that there has to be an independent left analysis of why you want court reform or why there needs to be fundamental constitutional change. And in my view, that independent analysis has to have at least two features that will not be raised by American centrism. Feature number one is a critique of how existing American constitutional practice and statecraft is deeply embedded with American empire. So resist the normative nationalism that turns any debate about the Constitution into one that is bound by the terms of the U.S. border. In other words, over the course of the second half of the 20th century, constitutionalism was essential to the story of American empire. And indeed, the American imperial order was itself a kind of constitutional settlement at home and abroad that had a very specific kind of reality, which is a persistent defense of legality, but a continual exercise of national security power and excess that effectively swallowed that legality. Features that we're seeing play out at present, where there's these invocations of a rule-based order, and yet the exercise of power makes those invocations not only hollow, but seem to be fundamentally opposed to any theory of viable liberal, let alone radical, legality. And so this means contesting the constitutional order, but linking how that constitutional order is operating both at home and abroad, and that by saying that one wants court reform, that doesn't mean that you let off the hook judges that have perpetuated a system of effectively state impunity, which for decades political leaders have been able to exercise forms of violence, whether it's police violence here or national security violence by presidents, without having any kind of accountability. And then relatedly, it's to say that the argument for constitutional critique is not about restoration. It's about, for the first time in the US, having a system that is genuinely democratic. And that requires a theory of constitutionalism that is a theory of politics, that doesn't imagine a constitution as standing above ordinary political action, that understands constitutional debates as one of the sites for enacting forms of experimentation, that for imposing different types of policy levers that can generate their own revolutionary reforms, that make it harder for the existing status quo to reproduce itself and make it easier for the kind of social world one wants to inhabit to actually take off. And this is where I'll end. And then all of that ties to an effort to avoid the persistent turn of any constitutional conversation into a debate about legal expertise and legal sort of technocratic solutions. Here, what I mean is that the only condition under which the country is going to actually enjoy something like genuine constitutional change in the path that I would view as truly emancipatory is if there's something like a transformative political majority that exists in this country that links the Constitution to the political, links the domestic to the foreign, and understands democratic socialism or social democracy as fundamentally anti-imperial. And for that to happen, the country has to move from what the historian of populism, Lawrence Goodwin, called the received culture of hierarchy, of atomized individualism, of the American way of life as itself a form of imperial power, to a movement culture. And that movement culture is something that has to emerge organically. In other words, it has to be something that in the schools and neighborhoods that people inhabit, in the workplaces that they attend, in the churches that they go to, that these ideas of both democratic socialism and anti-imperialism feel like the same kind of drinking water that Fox News pumps into our airports whenever you take a flight. And that's only possible, effectively, if you pursue changes to what you can think of as the meaning-making intermediate institutions that mark collective life, that link individuals to the big institutions of states. And that's unions and workplaces, that's schools, that's housing, that's political parties. And in a sense, it highlights how even if it might not look like big C constitutionalism, so it's not simplifying the amendment process, changes to these institutions to make them sites where ordinary people have expanded forms of bargaining power to contest those that they're opposed to, but also sites where just the worlds that they inhabit embody the kind of democratic aspirations that people want. That's essential to any kind of social change that then takes the form of getting rid of the Electoral College or universal healthcare. What this highlights is that we're living in a moment, and I think this is just all political moments, where there's a sense of the short term. And the short term is marked by truly destructive forms of politics that we see all around us, from the domestic to the global, and that require immediate forms of intervention to essentially protect, support those that are most vulnerable, as well as contest the worst forms of economic and political power that we see around us. But that short term has nonetheless to be connected to a medium and long-term political strategy and horizon that understands the conditions of genuine social change as tied precisely to this shift from a received to a movement culture and the construction of organic experiences within people's lives in which left ideas aren't just abstractions, but are both partial lived realities, and by being partial lived realities, genuine objectives that folks solidaristically are willing to fight over and claim. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. I guess my question is, considering we've had two very interesting individuals who have unfortunately been our presidents, say George W. Bush, who used the letter of the law to do horrible things when the spirit of the law doesn't seem to meet there, and Donald Trump, for lack of a better way, just doesn't care and does what the hell he wants to anyway. I guess my question is, as a socialist who sees some ground maybe off of the more radical tendencies of the revolution that never fully got realized outside of a narrow bourgeois liberal context, the question of how do we use what we have through the long drawn-out process to achieve enough things to allow for class consciousness and maybe a broader revolution or a broader question about what type of regime to live over, if necessary, and even save any notion of rule of law when it seems the concept of just following a strong man, or even when you have conservatives who might arguably be walking a line between fascist and classic liberal, who want to 1 minute say they support the rule of law and use backwards arguments from Stanford versus Dred Scott versus Stanford to undermine the 14th Amendment, which makes no sense to most people, even as legal scholars are at least trying to get their logic when it just seems they want to just justify their racism. For lack of better.
Yeah. So, I don't have a one-size-fits-all answer to that question, but maybe we can take one slice of it by thinking a little bit about how organizations like the IWW or the Panthers engaged in constitutional politics. So the Panthers were really interesting in that one of the things that they started doing in the 60s in places like Berkeley, elsewhere, was essentially observing the police, so that there's experience in the community of violence perpetrated by the police that goes unaddressed. And so Panther members would show up and just observe what the police were doing. And they would show up oftentimes carrying a copy of the Bill of Rights. And then they would take out the Bill of Rights and be like, I'm here exercising my free speech rights, and so you can't get rid of me from this corner. But also, I am observing what you're doing because what you're doing is in violation of these kinds of constitutional principles. Now, because groups like the Panthers did this, and by the way, IWW activists did very similar things, labor socialists did very similar things, early American communists did similar things. Because they were engaged in this kind of political tactic, which is connecting to the question, it's a way of saying there is a rule of law that establishes a set of legal principles, and that these legal principles are supposed to be upheld within the terms of the society. Then you have folks that say, well, these people are Constitution worshipers. See, even the Panthers worshiped the Constitution. But that misunderstands what they were actually doing. They were making a claim that even within the terms of this fundamentally unequal and unjust society, there are a set of legal limitations that those in power have agreed to. And that these legal limitations are supposed to constrain how they exercise violence and power. And by holding up the Bill of Rights in this kind of a context, it was to make the claim that, first of all, there are tools that you can use to limit the worst and most egregious forms of power, to protect your own community, to go to the courts, or to engage in various kinds of protest. But more than that this exposed something pretty foundational about the nature of the society. The society had constructed the socialist activist, the black radical, as the first person that was in fact lawless, when actually it was just the inverse. The figures that embodied legality were the ones that actually perpetrated various forms of state violence. And the people that had been constructed as lawless were instead those that were saying, at the very least that you could do is abide by the rules that you've established. And it meant that this defense of legality was interestingly tied all the way up to a critique of the existing legal order. So you could defend legality, protect those that were most vulnerable, while making a claim about the inherent lawlessness of the society, and to say that actually, if you genuinely want these principles to be implemented, you're probably going to need that Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention and a different type of constitutional order to make good on these values. By the way, I would say that, for instance, the South Africa's ICJ efforts are in this mode, which is to say, there's nothing, radical about the kind of legality that they're engaged in. And indeed, the international legal system is not one that embeds principles of sort of genuine equality. It's very much tied to the inequalities that marked the imperial period, as well as the power that the US had in establishing a set of rules in the mid-20th century. But the thing that lawyers are saying is, even within the terms of a system that's not fully just, there's certain presumptions about, again, the rule of law, and that these presumptions require imposing constraints that you yourself, as powerful states, have claimed to agree to. This is a form of political action that you can think of as imminent, but has been a long-standing way that activists use the rule of law while not sort of collapsing into a venerative pose, and recognizing that you can use legality both to protect folks that are genuinely vulnerable, but then also to push in politically discursive ways beyond the terms and the limitations of a legal order that needs to be transformed.
Here's about some of the specifics of what the Black Panthers were talking about, the radical, the People's Convention. What kind of constitutional stuff were they thinking of?
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing. So the convention takes place September 5-6, 1970. It's preceded by a massive crackdown by Rizzo and the police department in Philadelphia, where there's attacks on Panther offices. There are Panther members that are arrested and stripped before their offices. Photographs are taken. These actually spread worldwide, and it's like a huge deal. What Rizzo and company want is essentially nobody to show up. Nonetheless, by most accounts, you have like 10 to 15,000 people that actually end up coming to Philadelphia. You have some of like really significant political and cultural luminaries of the left that are present. The main events take place at Temple, and you have, for the big plenary sessions and speeches, 5,000 to 6,000 folks that end up packing halls. You can see some of the photographs. It's one of the first speeches that Huey Newton gives after being released from prison. And then the way that the actual convention is organized is through a series of working groups. These working groups, by the way, bring together all of these different folks of the New Left. So you have figures connected to gay liberation. You have folks connected to various kinds of feminist groups. That, by the way, is a lot of organizing done by Afeni Shakur, Tupac Shakur's mother, who was a significant political actor and constitutional thinker in her own right. She was very centrally involved in this. You have people from AIM, you have folks from anti-colonial movements abroad, SDS, you name it. What they produce in these working papers, working reports, isn't something like what we would think of as a conventional constitution. The idea was they were going to meet again in November in DC and then ratify a text. That, for lots of different reasons, both external violence as well as internal recriminations, especially between Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, like that doesn't end up paying off. But what these reports amount to is a much more comprehensive, almost party agenda. So it looks more like a party platform. And the strengths and weaknesses of it, I think, are interesting for us to reflect on. The strengths are in a way what I just described, which is they really give a fairly comprehensive snapshot of how all of these different groups, indigenous groups, anti-colonial activists, Puerto Rican independence folks, and black radicals were thinking about the idea of decolonization and what it would concretely mean in the US in a setting that's not like India, where there's like a small band of British imperial elites that can just like return back to England, but in a society that is fundamentally interwoven between white and non-white communities and constituencies. The weakness of the report, and I should also say the other thing that I think is quite interesting about it is that there's lots of space given for the movement demands of other groups that don't directly tie to the decolonial objective. So that there's a real sort of airing of black feminist arguments and early forms of analysis that would become like intersectional or interlocking ideas of interlocking oppression, an account of a gender division of labor that requires basic transformations to how reproductive and productive labor are conceived of, how healthcare is tied to reproductive rights, arguments about trans rights, LGBTQ rights that are quite remarkable for a document written in 1970. The weakness, however, is there is very little on the structures of governance. So there's a lot of the stuff that had been associated both with the SPA, but then also with earlier black socialists like Du Bois or Harry Haywood about how to reimagine American federalism, how to reconceive the nature of the states. That's not present. At that time, the person that was probably doing the most to articulate those kinds of arguments is James Boggs. Boggs and Grace Lee Boggs had a piece that ran called "The City is the Black Man's Land," where they called not just for a constitutional convention, but for taking the idea of that Harry Haywood had about breaking up the states in the South and transposing it to a world in which black people were no longer in an agricultural rural base, but in cities. And so how can you reconstruct a theory of democracy that's built around actual local rule, not this misshapen in-between state that's not really about local democracy, and then construct forms of federalism that tie the city to national governments in ways that ensure that different geographies might get represented, but within the terms of what we think of as one person, one vote. None of that's there at the convention, and we can think about why. This is a period, unlike the early 20th century, where for the Panthers, it's really not plausible that there is a electoral pathway to political transformation. In the first 3 to 4 decades of the 20th century, various kinds of socialists actually believed, because of the nature of organized working class politics in the US, that it was possible to win elections either under the SPA or maybe through New Deal coalitions, and then actually just enact both a transformative economic agenda, but also fundamental changes to the constitutional system. By the time you get to 1970, the conservatism effectively of the white working class, the breaking of a coherent working class consciousness because of how folks that would be part of a white working class are now living in suburban settings. They're enjoying the actual material benefits of American global power, dollar hegemony that's coming back to like infuse local white communities. All of this means that you have a nationalism that's invested in empire, that's suspicious of left politics, that's even suspicious of the class politics that the Panthers might bring to bear. And the fact that there's no electoral outcome means that you have very little of the focus on those kinds of reforms within the analysis, and I think to the detriment of the analysis. And it also, I think, then has really profoundly deleterious effects on where Panther politics goes, where you have a small range of people that end up embracing a kind of vanguardism and even armed revolt, and then most folks that end up turning to local kind of community programs, really important, good programs like, you know, breakfasts for kids and providing healthcare and ambulance services, but essentially abandoning the possibility of something like a multiracial coalitional majority that can transform American life. And so in a way, what I see as the lesson from that moment for us today is that we're living at a time where maybe for the first time, honestly, in American history, there is real cultural presence, even outside the left, on the democratic critique that socialists made, the kind of straightforward democratic critique. But within the left, which is not insignificant as a cultural force, even if it doesn't have institutional power, cross-racial sort of recognition of and investment in a decolonial agenda. And so it means that, in a way, we have an opportunity to take a set of demands that in the past have only been articulated oftentimes by a relatively small range of Black and non-white intellectuals, and think of them together as the basis for a genuine political platform. And so to push beyond what like the Panthers were sort of dealing with in 1970.
Hey, Aziz, thank you for this amazing talk. So I want to ask a question about like two different aspects of the Constitution, which you actually talked about a little bit in your last answer. I've never seen it, but I guess from my reading of the Constitution, when it's been reproduced online, I understand that it has like these two different parts, right? So it has the part where it sets up what you're calling structures of government. It says we've got to have an executive, we're going to have a judiciary, we're going to have Congress, and it's going to have these two houses. It sets up how elections are going to happen. It sets us what powers those branches have. It sets up federalism. And then, of course, there's the Bill of Rights part.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm understanding your position, you're saying the part that's really fucking us is like the first part. The second part is so vague and so sort of general. It can mean anything, right? It can mean slavery is consistent with equality, and a woman's right to choose is consistent with equality. I mean, they're vacuous generalities. But if I'm understanding you correctly, you really feel that it's the first part that we're bound with. But it seems to me, and again, I'm never studied this. Obviously, you have for a long time. That the veneration is really around the Bill of Rights, and it's an empty totem, right? It can mean whatever anyone wants it to mean. So it's easy for both sides to say that they venerate it when we fundamentally believe that what it is that it means totally opposite things. So I guess, and I think that's true about democracy, by the way. Like, we are constantly using democracy in two different ways. Like sometimes we're using it to mean just some mechanism for translating preferences that people have in their brains right now to like what policy should be. Sometimes we mean it in a deeply substantive way, which is, I think many of us in this room think you can't have democracy if certain basic freedoms and entitlements aren't met. Like, I think it's undemocratic for a woman not to have the right to choose. Like, I think it's undemocratic to not have basic right to housing and health, right? Like, you can't have democracy without that. But of course, the other side thinks the opposite, right? So that's what's like, we're using it in just two different ways. So I guess my question is like, am I right that the veneration, I think most people don't understand the first part. Shit, I teach this and I don't understand the first part. Like, it's confusing, the structural part. And I think B, it's hard, as you said about the story about the attempts at conventions. It's really hard to think about what would be better structures. Like, that shit's complicated. But it seems to me that your story is like, that's really what's imprisoning us. Is like the political structures don't allow us to translate the fact that in some sense we are a majority into policies. So is it really like, if the veneration is really about the second part, like the Bill of Rights part, is that really what's happening us, A, and B, like, I don't know, like, I mean, how do we change those structures? Because it does seem that anytime if we opened up that box, at least the standard line on the left is like, that would be a shit show if we had a constitutional convention. Now, maybe you have a different view on that, but most people are like, don't do that.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. Let me start with how I'm thinking of rights as fitting into this. So the main thing that I'm critical of is, precisely what I was referring to as the kind of official story around the Credal Constitution, that connects all of those different ideological elements, including an account of civil liberties that's joined to a story of economic liberty, market capitalism, that's tied to an entrenchment of the court, that's all then connected to an account of American global primacy. And one of the ways in which I think that official story has long legs culturally, even outside of the terms of the courts, is precisely how it ends up constructing what we should think of as a relevant right. So you're right to say it's a short constitution. The U.S. Constitution, even with its amendments, is 7,700 words. The average length of a constitution globally is about 20,000 words. The Indian Constitution is 150,000 words. Yeah. The most constitutions globally, again, we don't even have to get into the utopia of like the emancipation to come. Like most constitutions globally that have been written over the last half century include expansive forms of positive socioeconomic rights. So rights when it comes women's rights that are actually textually written, environmental protections, various kinds of indigenous rights, including forms of concurrent sovereignty, the likes of which that we've been discussing, alongside labor protection, socioeconomic rights, reproductive rights. I can't remember if I've said that already. None of that is in the text of the Constitution for a very simple reason, which is the Constitution is incredibly difficult to amend. And even though there's language that's potentially open to interpretation, there's deeply embedded cultural sense that what we think about when we think about rights in the US is essentially a relatively constrained set of negative liberties that are closely associated with property protections. And at a basic level, I think part of contesting the kind of the closing of American constitutional imagination that took place in the mid-20th century is thinking about rights as something that is much more potentially capacious. At the same time, another really central problem with the way that rights have been constructed in the US is that they're almost entirely associated with the courts. So the thought is there's all of that structure stuff that's complicated, but really, that's the stuff that we don't talk about when we talk about the Constitution until quite recently. What we talk about is the court litigating around the First Amendment or the Second Amendment or the Equal Protection Clause. And the way that you entrench rights is through court jurisprudence and protection. And that itself is a product of this mid-20th century narrowing. That if you were to talk to everybody from Thaddeus Stevens to Eugene Debs to W.E.B. Du Bois to Afeni Shakur, they would argue, or Crystal Eastman, who's a feminist socialist anti-war activist, one of the founders of the ACLU, a central figure in the book, early 20th century, they would have argued that, well, you shouldn't expect courts to protect the rights of the most vulnerable. It's an institution that's systematically organized around the privilege of those most powerful. And that instead, the best way to actually protect rights is through mass mobilization and organizing and through popular law. And it might be the case that there's successes in the courts, but to the extent that you're going to get it's actually going to be entrenched, it's likely through amendment or landmark statutes or various forms of mass political energy and even civil disobedience that impose certain kinds of cultural norms and expectations on those with political power. All of that, which I think far more accurately tells the story of how rights have in fact been protected in the country, has also been written out of the way that we think of the Constitution. And so in a sense, I worry that we're living in almost like the worst of both worlds at the present, where there is absolutely a structure. This is the stuff that you were talking about, a governing structure that puts a thumb on the scales to make certain outcomes more likely than others, that incentivizes the right at the same time to essentially defect from democratic norms because it can achieve its ends through minoritarian and authoritarian political practices. And we have a language of rights that is incredibly narrow and that presumes that an institution whose history is checkered, to say the least, is the way that we end up entrenching rights. And that requires, frankly, a very different way of understanding the relationship between governance, rights, and because this is the DSA, socialism. So Crystal Eastman, her view was that those three things went together. Democracy rights were mutually reinforcing, and both were the necessary condition for the kind of economic change that one might want. Where over the course of the 20th century, and especially in the context of the Cold War, all three of those ended up getting disentangled. A critique of democracy, replace it with a system of checks and balances that's deeply undemocratic, an account of rights that's preserved through the courts, and a vision of socialism that is a repudiation of basic liberties and has to be constrained, rejected, demonized. Where, in point of fact, if you look at the first half of the 20th century, most of the great defenders of both civil liberties and democracy were themselves socialists, from Eastman to Norman Thomas, and that the figures that claim the mantle of both democracy and rights were the folks that were primarily invested in undermining rights and promoting various forms of violence and power.
Thanks for being here. So there was this kind of very striking episode of waffling from the Harris Walz campaign recently. Yeah, where Tim Walz went out, said, "I believe the Electoral College should be abolished." Then the Harris campaign goes and says, "This is not our view." And I think that on some level, I believe that, yes, the Democratic Party is coming to a critique of the Constitution. But on the other hand, you see these kinds of episodes where they seem still very committed to these institutions that very clearly don't serve them. And you think maybe that the same thing, and I understand that you're a professor of law, but maybe this kind of goes into the American political development stuff that you work on. This kind of, if you think about what Bidenomics is as a program, it's essentially this kind of effort at appropriating certain aspects of the left critique of American political economy, and this kind of self-conscious critique by a lot of people within the Obama administration that we didn't, we've let inequality fester too much, and thus we've allowed the Sanders and the Trump insurgencies to happen. So they adopt these kind of overtures to class politics to ultimately defang these things. Is the same thing happening with the Constitution, insofar as they adopt this critique of the Constitution to defang the left, and to adopt the left into the Democratic Party, while they don't and prevent future insurgencies within the Democratic Party, like what Bernie Sanders did, while not actually truly believing in these things, as evidenced by the Harris campaign's repudiation of Tim Walz's critique of the Electoral College.
Yeah. So, and this actually is a way maybe to tie in the earlier question about how to think of convention calls and the sort of fears about another constitutional convention, maybe where I stand on that too. So first, yes, like a straightforward answer is yes, and there's a long history of this, and there's a long history of this when it comes even to constitutional politics. So socialists, progressives, populists in the early 20th century were making a series of arguments about the need for fundamental constitutional change. When Victor Berger gets elected to Congress as a socialist candidate out of Wisconsin, one of the first things that he does is bring a bill that would abolish the Senate, and then ends up facing censure because that's his policy. And that there was a recognition that, there's a lot of people that are upset with institutions like the Senate. And it's not a surprise that 1913 to 1920 is the period in American life where you see the largest burst of formal constitutional change. There are 4 constitutional amendments that actually make it through a really difficult process on some of the most important issues of the day, on direct election of the Senate, on constitutionality of the federal income tax, on temperance, and then also on 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. One way to read what was going on was a recognition by more moderate politicians that unless there's some efforts to address these social issues, you're going to lose support within your own party base, but then also there's the possibility of even more far-reaching forms of social change that might take place. And so I think this kind of activity or relationship between what you can think of as a radical frank and more moderate actors has a long history. We're seeing it play out in the present. But I actually think the more interesting thing to me is like that Waltz said this. And honestly, if you were to listen to a range of fairly mainstream Democratic politicians, and if they talk about the court and about the constitutional system, it is striking by comparison with just 5 or 10 years ago, or the books that are coming out right now by folks that have long been real kind of, venerators of the constitutional system that are closely tied to more traditionally like liberal political perspectives.
Doesn't that suggest that they can split it? That they can say like, I'm venerating the Bill of Rights part, but I can like
No, so I
talk
think
shit about the structural.
I think there's something that's going on, which is that there's a recognition that the institutions are producing all of these kinds of social problems, but there is this profound, and maybe it's actually tied to the split that you're describing. There's this profound tension within, I think, liberal elite spaces. And the tension is, oh my God, first there's the specter of Trump, but like what happens if we give up on the Constitution? Concretely, like what happens to the rights protections that one likes and the language that one likes in specific parts of the document that have in the past produced various types of ameliorative changes? But I honestly think even more than this splitting, which I think some version of it takes place between the bad structure and the good rights, like, can you have a protection of these rights if you don't have this document, is the way in which this text and the right story, but the text is so closely associated with Cold War liberal national identity. Like, what happens to the account of the country that Obama and Clinton, and it could be Harris, Biden, like what happens to the vision of the national project that operates at home but also abroad if you abandon the Constitution? And it's why there's this interesting kind of pinging back and forth that takes place where, you'll hear the stinging critique, but then when Trump says that all the election rules have to be terminated, including those in the Constitution, Bates, as like White House spokesman, comes out and is like, how dare he? This is the Constitution is sacrosanct. It's the soul of the nation. There's all of this investment. So at the same time that the Constitution is being presented as a real problem, and there's a fairly stinging critique that's emerging, there's also the continuous turn whenever it feels like the Constitution is endangered, and with it a story of the country and a vision of how sort of liberty and equality is supposed to operate in the US, like a return back to the Constitution as salvation. And I think part of what's standing behind this is real fear about what happens if the system is opened up. So right now in the US, the most sustained effort to actually have a convention to change the Constitution is coming from the American right. It's coming from the Convention of States, Ron DeSantis, a bunch of different groups. What they want to do with the Convention of States, and so this is the nature of the project, is there's a kind of recognition that like, look, the Republican Party is representing a smaller and smaller slice of the public pie. And what happens when these counter-majoritarian institutions like the Senate and the Supreme Court can no longer hold? And so they're proposing, using Article 5, which goes through the states, to imagine a new constitution that's very similar to the current one, but that locks in the authority of minority constituencies, in particular by saying that states, a majority of states, can overturn federal laws that the majority of states view as unconstitutional. That's like the heart of the Convention of States project. And that raises a real issue, which is if you, not forget about on the left, but if you're a liberal who's like, this constitutional structure isn't serving the vision of the country that I'm committed to, well, what happens if you open the system and the rules make it easier to have a convention that backs this convention of states? And that's a really scary thing. My view about the response to that is that, one, that suggests that while I support a convention, and I actually think it's really important for folks on the left to have an idea about how they would construct a convention, whatever that convention is actually not going to abide by the terms of Article 5. Just like any other society, that the conventions are something that are the product of a mobilized revolutionary base, and they don't abide by the rules set up by the previous order. Like folks in Chile, whatever you think about that process, they weren't like, you know who had a really good process for constitutional change? Pinochet. Let's use that approach. No, you construct new frameworks for constitutional change, including a convention, and that's something that I think folks on the left should think about. But then they should also be aware of the range of forces in the here and now, and frankly, the extent to which the mobilized power is on the right. But then the response isn't, okay, so therefore we have to just double down on a kind of venerative defensive crouch that just is going to reproduce the problems that we see. This is a political problem that has to be solved politically through organizing, that then uses different instruments and means to pursue various forms of constitutional change. Maybe sub-constitutional arrangements, maybe legislative interventions, maybe some of the changes to the intermediate institutions that I was discussing that creates the condition, maybe down the line, for a convention, even if not now. And it tells me that, in a way, perhaps the biggest difference between the liberal imagination on constitutional change and what I would view as a left imagination is that the liberal imagination is deeply anti-populist and sees constitutional change as a product of legal technocracy. There's a set of policy solutions, and somehow miraculously one can get everyone to agree to those policy solutions. It's also why there's such an investment in the kind of civic nationalist rhetoric of the Credal Constitution of Obama. It's like, maybe if we just get somebody even more charismatic than Obama, he'll somehow be able to paper over all of these divisions and liberal technocrats can solve these problems. Where the truth is, there are foundational material conflicts of interest in this society that no matter how charismatic the figure, a simple story about the nation isn't going to paper over them. And that there's no way that getting the right arrangement of elites in a room to solve problems technocratically will get outside of the fact that there are power distributions at play in those arrangements. And that the only way, honestly, to generate the change one might want is by having to invest in like the difficult stuff of politics. I see Harris, going back to the very beginning, like, why is Harris disavowing it? It's the same reason why the only moment in the first debate where she's like, you know what, I actually am going to interrupt and I have something to say, and it's I support fracking. It's that she's running a campaign right now where she's like, I am Ronald Reagan reborn in 2024, focused, like a laser on a specific kind of constituent in a certain set of swing states. All of this, note, is a function of the dysfunctions of our constitutional order that create these as incentives for democratic politicians. And that includes running away from anything that might seem remotely controversial, even if, frankly, I think the leadership, or if not the leadership, much of the party, the elected party officials of among the Democrats have now reached a point where it's like, yeah, it's self-evident we should get rid of the Electoral College. It's self-evident that the courts need to be reformed.
My question is it possible to wonder if another civil war is inevitable along the same lines? And where should socialists be potentially strategic in thinking about a potential disunion movement? Because if some of the fundamental contradictions of this country has put a left that's leaning socialist and a right that seems to be half classic liberal and half toying in fascism, is it necessary to save what was a fucked up project from Jump Street?
Yeah. So, it's an interesting thing that there was, within abolition, there were two perspectives on how to think of the Constitution's relationship to slavery, articulated by Wendell Phillips and by Frederick Douglass. So Wendell Phillips was a Boston abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, great Black order and activist. Phillips said the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. And he said, he was uninterested in a way in looking at like what some of the framers might have intended, though he ultimately concluded that he thought the intention was a promotion of slavery. What he was mostly focused on was how the Constitution operated in practice. And in practice, what it did, because of things like the 3/5 clause, but also the nature of the state system, is it dramatically overrepresented the interests of enslavers. And it's the reason why so many of the presidents were either Southerners or folks from enslaving states. It's why in Congress there was a gag rule to make it impossible to talk about the issue of slavery. It's why the Supreme Court was structured the way that the Supreme Court was structured. His response to that was then to say, no union with enslavers, a call for disunion. Frederick Douglass's response was, no, the Constitution should be thought of as an anti-slavery document because the language of the Constitution includes all of this is the stuff that was coming up in the exchange about rights. It includes all of this open, ambiguous language about potential universal equality, and that you can just interpret that language in ways that would aspirationally commit the country to anti-slavery values. And moreover, politically, you shouldn't engage in disunion, because what would that mean to the millions of enslaved people in the South? So you, as a white Northern abolitionist, might feel a kind of moral purity, but you're stuck with you're thrown into a country that is the product of this history, that is not just the non-enslaving states in the North, and that creates certain kinds of responsibilities for any transformative project. My own view, maybe then and perhaps now, is like a split of the two, which is to say, I think that Phillips has the stronger of the argument when it comes to thinking about the constitutional order. One of the pitfalls I think American liberalism fell into over the last half century in particular was to imagine, hey, there's this open language. I can come up with all of these creative interpretations. I can make the Constitution mean whatever it means. When in point of fact, there is a system that established modes of power and that was tied to these profound ideologies and narratives of nation that ended up replicating kind of like the worst political instincts and generating some of the worst political outcomes. And so we have to be open-eyed about the fact that we have an infrastructure of governance that's fundamentally incompatible with a world that one would seek. But we are thrown into a political community. It's a political community that we did not necessarily choose, but that shapes our own experience. And that also is marked by generations of folks that are true heroes. They're not the heroes that are oftentimes presented, because many of them were internationalists and indeed even anti-nationalists. Many of them contested the terms of the national security state as well as the jingoism of ordinary American life. But nonetheless, there were American heroes in the sense that they struggled alongside activists. We can think of it, women's movement, and indigenous politics, and black politics, and labor politics, and immigrant politics, and third world activism, and the kind of third world networks that link the U.S. to Asia, Africa, and Latin America, for a fundamentally different collective community. And I worry that sort of investing in the present in stories of disunion is a disservice to both like these histories of political struggle, and also a disservice to a sense of solidarity, what it means to actually work in concert with those that are in fact most marginalized and oppressed. And I think what it tells us about the present is probably two things. I'm not good at prognosticating, and I don't try to. My guess about where the country is going to go is that while, there's potential for some of the very worst things to happen, most likely the country is going to muddle along in some version of what we see, which is engaging in these cycles of disaffection, crisis, and paralysis. This is really the story of how most large empires end up steadily breaking down, which is their political class becomes, completely sort of corrupted, and their institutions are marked by crisis and paralysis, are not able to address the problems of the day. And what that calls on us to do is work that, in a deep sense, one should have open eyes about the difficulty of, which is how to arrest these developments and how to do it from, something I've said elsewhere, from effectively the heart of empire. There are not a lot of examples of imperial metropoles reconstructing their own social order in ways that are genuinely anti-imperial around institutions, economic and political, that are genuinely in service of all, based on a theory of the commons as a repository of all, and solidarity as something that's not racially or otherwise restricted. That makes the goal hard, but that's always effectively been the goal of the left. There's been no moment, if you look back 10 years, 100 years, 200 years, where the path to power was open for the left. And that's because the path to power is always open for those that seek to entrench the existing hierarchies and the existing status quo. The path to power is never open for those who contest the terms of the society. But that doesn't mean that their struggle and our struggle isn't worthy, or that there aren't opportunities for agency and change on behalf of freedom within these structures. It just requires a kind of analysis of those structures and a recognition of what such agency would entail.
Okay, well, thank you, Aziz, for that fabulous presentation. Thank you all for coming, and that stirring call you put out for us to fight the pig system. That's what DSA is all about. And if you're not a member, please do correct that serious oversight. You can do that by visiting socialist.nyc/join. And I should have some announcements, but I'm very poorly organized. But you can look at the DSA website, and there are just multiple things happening every day you can exercise your activist muscles on. But thank you all again, and thank you, Aziz.